Welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast, where it is our mission to explore the business and future of video games. We bring together the industry's brightest builders, investors, and thinkers to keep a pulse on current events, dissect emerging trends in games, share lessons learned, and have a great time. This podcast is also part of Naavik's growing ecosystem, which ranges from free and premium research to consulting and advisory services. For more information, visit www.naavik.co. This episode is brought to you by Pragma. Pragma is a back-end game engine founded by the engineering leaders who built the platforms for some of the largest live service games, including League of Legends, Fortnite, Destiny 2, and Plants vs. Zombies 2. Pragma powers services like accounts, matchmaking, and player data for the world's most ambitious live service games. The Pragma backend game engine is the only solution that is truly extensible so that game designers aren't blocked by clumsy black box designs. With Pragma, studios no longer need to hire a large backend team and get the ultimate peace of mind that their game will always be ready to scale. To learn more, simply head to pragma.gg or check out the link in the show notes. And with that, let's jump into the episode.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Naavik Gaming Podcast. I'm your host, Alex Takei, and this is the Interview and Insights segment. Today, we're being a little meta, breaking the fourth wall, and talking about the role that those who build blogging, game consulting, and podcasting streams for the professional game development community play in our industry and the challenges concomitant with that aforementioned task, specifically building a profitable enterprise while we're at it. In other words, today we're talking about us, Naavik Gaming, and others like us, such as elite game developers, Deconstructor of Fun, and GameMakers, all niche news and advisory firms in some capacity or another, either through podcasting, deep dives, writing, newsletter, or consulting, assisting game developers across the vast spectrum of AAA, mobile, Web3, indie, investing, to make decisions across production, business, design, economies, and more. And so to do so, I've gathered some of the best in the biz. First, our very own Aaron Bush, co-founder of Naavik and another voice you've heard on air all the time. Aaron, say hello.
Hello.
Next, representing Deconstructor of Fun in a prior life in GameMakers is Joseph Kim, ex-podcast host on Deconstructor and current host at GameMakers, which he somehow finds time to do during his day job of being CEO at Leela Games. Welcome, JK.
Thank you.
And finally, closing us out is Joakim Achrén, founder of Elite Game Developers and formerly the co-founder of Next Games, which was acquired by Netflix in 2022 for $70 million. Welcome.
Hey, thanks, Alex.
All right, so the super team has assembled, and now it's all time for you to start arguing about whose podcast is better. But I kid. In all seriousness, we're here to discuss a pretty meta issue for us all, and that's although there are 3 billion gamers in the world by the latest survey data, the count of gaming professionals across the globe pales in comparison, and by what I've read probably sits around 330 to 500K in the West. Furthermore, this is parsed into a few select pieces: AAA developers, mobile developers, indies, Web3 degens, business folks, so like PMs, biz dev, finance, and investors. And each one of our podcasting brands has dug their heels in to find a further niche. So GameMakers is described as a free resource for other mobile game developers with an emphasis on free-to-play. Elite Game Developers brands itself as an online resource to help gaming founders. Deconstructor of Fun holds the crown for probably the most popular news podcast, i.e. information distribution and discussion of trends. And then finally, Naavik's niche is the business of gaming, helping any gaming professional do business stuff. And so it's important to see here that none of us truly serve the 3 billion player consumer side, unless those players happen to also be industry professionals. And thus the conundrum is, how do we build a profitable business off the backs of the same audience we're all competing for? Not to mention there's another unspoken competitor in the room, which is anybody with a LinkedIn account or a Substack. So to start, we're going to give some grounding on what our organizations do and how big they are. So let's go around a circle. Aaron, I would love to start with you. Could you describe, who works at your organization, what services you provide, et cetera?
Yeah, and I guess the first thing I would say is that none of us are really content companies, right? We're all content-fueled businesses in some way that, make money doing other stuff, which I think is a pretty big difference compared to like the B2C world, or even just, people who are individual on Substack or something like that. So there's interesting, differences in there to dig into. But revenue-wise, Naavik is vast majority a consulting business. helping teams with game design, economy design, market research, due diligence, etc. And we use content as really a top of funnel way to build our audience, our brand, and of course, give back to the community. My roots from starting Master the Meta way back in the day, just for fun, have kind of always veered around, just creating content, learning about the businesses of games, and then, increasingly leaning on other people who have much more expertise and a bunch of other things that I don't, to kind of fill us out in a lot of ways. Plus, it's just fun to build like an internal community of contributors. And so, Naavik, we have really 5 employees essentially that are full time, but we have another 30-ish or so contributors that are wide ranging in focus. Some of them lean on Naavik for a good chunk of their income through consulting. And of course, we have many others who have full-time jobs as game designers, as founders, product managers, you name it, that contribute in other ways, often lighter ways, such as joining the podcast or writing the newsletter once a month, for example. And even though managing a system, that has many people, that brings about operational complexity and headaches sometimes. But we find that it's worth it because it allows us to dig into more types of topics in a higher quality way, more globally, and allows us to reach more people who aren't just like adding another see the number go up on the newsletter, but like build a real relationship with us as a company, and that leads to more upside in other ways on both sides. So yeah, I mean, I guess that would probably be my answer to your question. I'm not sure if there's other areas you want to dig into there, but I'll say, like, our goal has never been to reach the most people. It's just always been to reach the best people. And that's just kind of a reflection of who our business is and the types of people that we ultimately serve. And that has like big trickle down effects on how we think about content and how we, push ourselves out into the world. But hopefully that's a good summary of Naavik and content there.
Got it. And so before we pass it to JK, succinctly, basically, and this is obviously, I'm cheating because I'm very familiar with Naavik. We have about 30 to 35 people split, basically one third between podcasting, writing, and consulting. And then we've got a couple podcast pipelines. We report on the news. We would do some interview structuring. And then we basically do weekly deep dives and a bi-weekly newsletter. And we also provide consulting services. So is that the way that I would describe Naavik in a nutshell?
That's what I should have said at the very beginning. Thank you, Alex.
All right, I'll go. JK, what about GameMakers?
Yeah, so GameMakers started off as a blog. Really, the objective initially was just more as a learning and sharing platform where I would write about some learnings that I had in the hopes of getting feedback and hearing from people out in the audience somewhere who would be reading what I wrote about. Since then, I think in the current form, it's more of a newsletter, YouTube podcast. But I would say that the current objective of what I'm doing and why I spend time developing content is that it turns out that similar to Aaron, it's not like a primary business, right? I actually spend less than 5 hours a week in terms of content. But for me, it's been something that's been very helpful in the sense that all of our best employees at the company. So, my full-time job is running a free-to-play game studio working on an FPS shooter game, but all of our best employees have joined because of content that they've watched or read about, things like that. So that I think from a reach perspective and being able to find the kind of people that we're looking for, it's been very powerful. And also from an investment perspective, like I didn't have to actually reach out to many investors because people were aware of me and some of our content. And even during our seed round of funding, this was back. And by the way, just to be clear, I don't represent Deconstructor of Fun anymore at all. It's been a while since I've done that, so I don't think I can speak too much on Deconstructor. But I can talk about a little bit about the past. But back in those days, I had mentioned on a podcast that we were going to be raising funding, and then that round, as well as our Series A round, I would say that the fact that I was doing content and investors became aware of our activities, it really helped us close those funding rounds. And so I do think that to the point about for the game development ecosystem being so small, I I would find it hard to. I think it'd be very difficult to just create a standalone business, or at least in the ways that all of us are kind of doing content right now. If you want to have a business that makes a lot of money, I don't think that's the approach. But I do think that there are these other effects in terms of reach and being able to reach out to people in the industry that might make a difference for your other business, whatever that may be.
Got it. So you're a YouTube podcast and a written blog, and how many people newsletter and how many people work at GameMakers? Are you a one man show?
It's basically a one man thing, although I'm trying to change that. So I have we have because it's recruiting related. I do, so our HR at Lila Games will prepare market data for me, and then I'll kind of go in and comment and add and look at one game a week. So yeah, I don't do much now, but now that recruiting is becoming even more important for us, I do plan on increasing my time from call it 5 hours a week to 10 hours a week.
Got it. Interesting.
And a shout out to your co-founder, JK. He's great with his videos, like Paul.
Oh yeah, Paul, when Paul makes videos, he does so I would say I'm more a quantity, he's more a quality.
Yeah, it's amazing stuff. Can't wait for a new video. It's been a few years already. So.
I'll tell him. Yeah, actually, he is planning on doing something. I think it's going to blow people's minds if he actually pulls this off. But we won't see that for another couple months. But if he does what he's planning, I think it's going to be very entertaining.
Such a tease.
All right, yeah, okay. Good. This is a perfect time to kick it to you.
Yeah, so I started in 2019. That was 4 years ago. About right now, it's coming up. So it's a newsletter and a podcast, and I do a lot of online templates that you can download, like an NDA template, for instance, for your company, or like a cap table breakdown, like different kind of documents that are useful as tools when you're doing a gaming startup. So I put together that kind of it's like a knowledge base or resource for founders, and that's the focus. I did have a lot of aspirations early on to actually monetize through premium content. I remember there was under a year since I'd been live. I put out the course, like an online course, paid online course on Teachable, which was $5.99, where you get 5 hours of lecture videos from me on how to pitch to investors, like a games company, and you get three pitching training calls with me over Zoom, which you can book to Calendly. So I think that went quite well. I've sold probably 50 of those courses over the years, and several founders actually ended up going VC backed after they went through the course. So the success rate, probably monetizing side of things, it's not something that I could make a living on, but it's been very impactful for a lot of founders and companies. So I think with these kind of businesses, it's sort of you can't really, it's not about okay, you have a limited amount of runway and you need to achieve something or you go bust. But when you're doing a newsletter or podcast, it's more about there's always going to be another newsletter next week, another podcast next week, and it grows and grows, and people find you, and there's less churn than there's new user acquisition, let's say, organically coming up. That's what I've seen. So these are kind of businesses that aren't worth a lot in a few years, but 10 years into this might I might have a really interesting business in my hands, but I don't treat it as a salary business. We're probably going to go into that later, but I do a lot of angel investing, and I have an angel syndicate as well, which I operate, and all of those kind of funnel back towards complementing each other as businesses.
That's really interesting. I don't know if you know of like Brad Feld from Foundry Group, who runs venture
Yeah.
deals, and they do a similar course where you can just download it. It helps you. It's not bespoke to gaming, right? It's for basically the Silicon Valley entrepreneur, but it is like a very interesting monetization strategy to sell that content, talk about pitching, talk about how to organize your cap tables, et cetera. So it's really cool to see like how many different value propositions each three of us have. And it's like, we talk about this is like, very niche, like game business people, but Naavik is like mostly a consulting business for game economies. JK is using his as like a free to play recruiting tool. You're using it also like as a deal sourcing engine and mostly founder focused. And so I think it's really interesting. A lot of us have mentioned a little bit about what kind of drives revenue in those capacities. And so I'd love to go a little bit deeper into that, right? Sort of like what are our business models given those specific niches? And so Aaron, maybe we'll bump back to you. I would love to talk about what sort of drives revenue and what sort of drives ROI, because as we have kind of succinctly said, you can't really do this thing like on its own. There needs to be some sort of other activity that you're almost like pairing alongside of it.
So it's a good question. The way I think about our business model and ROI is that obviously we have a consulting business where we meet clients, get hourly rates, sometimes longer term projects, and built up a great roster over time. Content has always been core to what we do. So we've had Naavik Pro, which is like a premium like research business that did pretty well from the standpoint of like if you were a Substack writer, like you would wish that you had our numbers for like a premium tier, but as a business like it's a bit different, and so we're making some changes there to kind of put less emphasis on premium and more emphasis on just like truly scaling out awesome free content. And so there's much more to come about that in the weeks ahead that we're excited about. But really the way that I have kind of think about this and what I've learned is that a lot of this is from the last business I was at, the Motley Fool, which published a lot of content about investing, but monetized through like premium services of like you join a fund or you subscribe to some investment advice service or something like that at different tiers. And what I learned from that I have taken to Naavik is that I think a lot of people think about like the user acquisition funnel or just like an audience funnel backwards, where in a B2B sense, typically what's not the best thing to do is just focus on building an awesome large audience and then selling them something. Is actually more the reverse, where you start with more the product that you have and then build from that to kind of determine what your content is and what your focus is on, like what you put out onto the free side. And the reason for that is because when you kind of start from the bottom of the funnel, so to speak, and you build your foundation there really well, what changes is that the LTV of your audience just becomes a lot higher because one single conversion changes the economics pretty heavily on what makes sense to do. And so for us at Naavik, we're trying to think most about like what are the products and services that we can offer to truly generate the most value to as many people we can across the industry. And then once we have that set, then it's thinking about, all right, how do we reinvest into like really building our brand and our audience and like helping the industry more broadly through all of the content and other things that we do. And so that's at a high level view how we think about ROI. But when it comes specifically to content, just a couple quick things I'll say is that not all content is created equally. Some content definitely has much higher ROI than others, or to different people. And so, what we've learned is, for example, we published a game deconstruction on Axie Infinity a couple of years ago. That was one really awesome long form piece of content that probably had 100x the impact of anything else we did that quarter. And so there's something really powerful and recognizing things like that. The other part too is, and I alluded to this before, is that for us at least, it's not about building the largest audience. It's about building the best audience for us, because one new right relationship can be pretty transformative and move the needle for us as a business, also revenue wise, and then allow for even more reinvestment. And so much of what we do is focused on like truly serving the people that we want to be in business with over a long period of time, and that informs so much of the decision making that goes on. And there's still so many ways that we can improve and things to learn and new ways to grow and such. But that's the mindset that we have right now.
Mm, mm. And so, JK, is that, and for Joakim, is that sort of the same for you? Sort of like serving the right customer versus a broader base appeal? Wondering whether or not you guys can also talk about that as a strategy for each of your individual brands.
Yeah, well, I mean, I can start. For me, it's more about recruiting and learning. So I do think like if there was a focus more on revenue or reach or things of that nature, the way that I would be oriented and the topics that I would cover would be completely different, right? Because if I were more focused on reach or trying to reach more people, the content would be more consistent, and you would be trying to follow topics. Like to Aaron's point about Axie Infinity, there are certain topics that if you're fast and if you're current, you're going to get a lot more users. And so the way that I've oriented my content is more around what's going to help my business. So, for example, as I was going through the fundraising process, I released a lot of podcasts on fundraising. If I am interested in a specific topic like the impact of IDFA deprecation, things like that, then I do a podcast on that. And so to some degree, I'm kind of niche, and my content is niche because I'm only covering the topics that will help me or that I'm interested in.
So this is the JK problem podcast, basically.
It could be, yeah. But I would say that the way I do think though that one of the things I do think is more important is more reach. So while I probably will still try to focus 50 to 80% of the content that I work on things that are relevant, current to me, I do think there should be more content that can be like an Axie Infinity type of, type of episode to draw in more, to be more effective on the reach side. And so I also think that I'm going to try and put a little bit more time in and also just get a little bit more help. So I'm exploring things like that right now, but haven't started yet.
In a way, like Elite Game Developers was always about the founders. That was the idea, to actually like the mission and everything, to help founders, not sort of like learn everything the hard way. So I went through a lot of interesting times in startups, and I definitely want to share those kind of learnings. So it's in a way. The customer is very clear for me, like who it is. It's the gaming founder, a person who wants to do a startup. It's a long tail of people out there. So this Monday I posted a question on LinkedIn about like who wants to go and record a pitching session with me that goes public on YouTube where I give feedback. And I got like hundreds of requests. There's like so many people out there with pitch decks trying to reach investors. Of course, it's like very limited amount of people who get into the raising from a VC. But I think like I want everybody to have the chance to get better at it, get better at like what they're trying to build, learn what's going on inside the investor's mind, because it's not a lot of people are sharing, which is part of the thing that like all of us showed up on the scene in the last 5 years. So Deconstructor was a blog before that, but the podcast really blew it up in I think people's knowledge. I don't think there was really like a serious sort of like a business sharing and like posting of these kind of things that we're doing, all of us nowadays.
Yeah. I think like that is yours is particularly interesting because it's also, as the founder of Elite Game Developers, you're uniquely equipped to help people with that because of like what you have done in the past. And so I guess a question for you is, when you think about growth, you've got 100 applications to do a pitch session. And maybe you are currently right now maybe like a smaller like one-man show shop. How do you plan to sort of scale that and grow that over time, as that becomes probably pretty unsustainable to basically be a really strong guide and mentor to all of those founders if if the demand there is so high?
So I've come to the conclusion I can keep it as a one-man show as long as I don't start expanding into like what I'm doing. Like if I do a newsletter on a weekly basis, if there's a podcast, like, and I don't do more than that. Like I share some new templates and like things like that. But it can be something that I don't really need another person if I reach. Now I have almost 10,000 subscribers on the newsletter. If it goes to 20, 30, 40,000, like I don't need another person to handle the like the load. So it's great what all these modern technologies can give you. And now we're having AI come and assist us as well. So it's looking really bright for the one-man show, I'd say.
Got it. And in terms of the growth for the newsletter, right? Where do you feel like that has really been driven from? Was that something that was done purposefully, intentionally, blasted and marketed in specific areas? Talk about your journey from like 0 to 10,000 newsletter subscribers.
Yeah, sure. I think like everything started and still is like a lot of social media pull in. Like I do a lot of posting every day on social media. So that helps people to discover me. So I would say like virality is really cool. Like I hear a lot of people tell me that, oh yeah, I'm sending your newsletter to a lot of people immediately. So that's just happening organically, and I don't need to do anything else besides not hold back on what kind of content I post. I think the third sort of angle there is like just keeping making interesting content, and that will sort of take care of itself. So I don't do any marketing. I have done like these things called lead magnets, which are the templates. I don't know if you guys know the term lead magnet, which helps you to grow an email list. So that was the intention with the templates in the early stages. But now I've actually started creating more and more just direct links to a Google spreadsheet on my website that here you go. So I think there's a certain point where it just starts growing on its own.
Mm-hmm. And Aaron and JK, have you experienced any of this type of growth where it's mostly organic, or has there been a different story for the growth to whatever number of newsletter subscribers that Naavik or GameMakers has?
I mean, it's been purely organic in different ways, and there's still a ton of things that we're really bad at. Like Naavik and social media is a really bad combo right now. There's so much more we could do and learn from Joakim about how to improve. And other areas like SEO, we know we can do better, and we're taking steps towards all of these things. But really, all of our growth really has just come from like great content standing out and people sharing it. And different content resonates with different people. Even having different contributors has helped us because we have different people sharing different things in different places, and that's nice. And so there's always been like a slow and steady trickle of new subscribers, at least for newsletter podcast over time, with occasional bursts here and there depending on something that gets shared more for whatever reason. And of course you see some growth too whenever you make certain changes. Like we haven't had success with the lead magnets, so to speak, despite our attempts. I don't know what we did wrong there, but we definitely have had once we have like changed the cadence of the newsletter or launched a new type of like podcast segment or something like that, we've seen more growth come from different places as well.
Yeah. And I guess that also like brings up the question of like growth in a specific vertical. So like growing listenership on the podcast or a horizontal lateral expansion across media formats and services that you provide. And so I think Naavik is actually maybe a little bit different than than GameMakers or elite game developers, where there's actually like a vast suite of services that are able to be provided versus GameMakers a little bit more podcast and newsletter, and then Joakim is more of like the founder journey and anything that they need and help and assistance with that. So how do we think about like kind of like running deep in terms of like one specific vertical and growing that way, or growing horizontally?
I'm pretty focused on niche topics. I think out of all of us, I'm probably the most niche, but Yeah, it's tough. I think the broader you go, I think the greater the top of funnel. And I do think that just going back to the previous question, I do think social media does have a big impact. I know, like, I'm probably the absolute one of the worst in the world at Twitter. So I mainly just read on Twitter, and anytime I post something,
Yeah.
it's like
but to be
face
honest,
plant.
like it took years. it took years for me to. It's still crawling on Twitter, but LinkedIn worked. I don't know what I'm doing
Right.
like that works on LinkedIn, but Twitter it's still
Yeah,
crickets.
LinkedIn, I think I do okay, but on Twitter, like some of the people I know in like for some of the other newsletters that I follow, it does seem like Twitter is a huge a component in terms of driving virality and growth on their newsletters. So I just don't think there's a good, I think you need a certain level of scale or traction or reason for people to read your Twitter stuff, which I don't have right now. So I'm probably going to wait. And then when the time is right, maybe try to grow Twitter later. But anyway, going back to the question, I'm pretty niche, and hopefully we'll broaden up a little bit in the near term future.
Got it. I see.
I think going deep is underrated versus broad, in the sense that like you can really capture a specific audience if you're consistent and high quality about something specific, like what Joakim does, with founders is very specific and goes very deep over time into lots of different topics. And it seems to be doing very well. But I don't think there's like one recipe for success, but like the most important thing at the end of the day is just like the quality of your content, and whether it's good enough to resonate with a lot of people and get shared and get start conversation and things like that. So that's always the battle at like every step of the way, like getting aligned on like what the content should be, making sure the analysis is right, you know doing our best to play whack-a-mole with typos and all of that kind of stuff. And for us as a team, maybe we see more of the complexity there that just arises when you have different people on different functions doing different things. That is a lot easier to manage as a one-man show. And I'm also bullish on people being able to step up and kind of scale themselves in more ways over time too. But yeah, going deep is underrated, but really at the end of the day, what matters most is just like the quality of your content, in my opinion.
Yeah. And I guess that brings us to the question of quality of content is a derivative of the quality of labor in a way. And so right now, like JK and Joakim, you guys are a little bit more of like one-man shows, but I'd love to hear your perspectives on recruiting and growing new talent to join your team. And I think Joakim, you'd mentioned something about you don't think of this as being a salary-oriented business, but I was actually writing a paper in my leadership and entertainment class at Stanford, and there's been all these trends in terms of like Waypoint being canceled at Vice. There's G4 TV, which is another brand that was supposed to be making games TV content that totally got canceled. And kind of the theme is that there's too many like chefs in the kitchen, right? There's everybody on LinkedIn, everybody with a Substack, right? So how do you basically everybody has this tremendous amount of publishing power. So how do you recruit somebody to come join like GameMakers or Elite Game Developers or Naavik when they could also just like kind of self-publish themselves and kind of build and start to build their own brand? How do you guys think about recruiting top voices? And maybe Joakim, since you had mentioned the salary business thing, maybe I'll bump it to you.
Yeah, like I had recently a guest author on my newsletter, which was like something probably like a year ago I would have sort of felt like, oh, it's my newsletter. I'm not sure if I want to bring anybody on board. But I have had Kim Nordstrom come and write about like his work and as an advisor for gaming companies. He used to be at King and then at Paradox, and like he's actually writing a book right now about leadership in gaming, and he was really good, and like the open rate for the emails that went out with his piece were amazing, and I heard that he got a lot of new people reaching out to him because of this. So I think like maybe thinking about like recruiting people is more like, hey, do you want to utilize my platform to bring out something that it's important for the industry. Like Kim had like a really good topic that he covered. So I'm happy to do that. Use my sort of like the platform as a megaphone for people who really resonate with the mission that I have.
Got it. And what about you, JK? Anything similar to that?
So there isn't like a whole lot of revenue associated with the content. I think all of us, right? We do it for another objective. But having done it for a long time in terms of like starting with a blog and keeping that old audience all the way through, I think one thing that GameMakers offers is just access to some really high level people in the industry. So maybe one thing I can push back on you, Aaron, is that I also do think that while quality is important, it does seem that quantity and consistency can sometimes be more important than quality. And so, kind of what I've noticed is even if I'm just a little bit more regular, that numbers tend to go up more than if I'm just kind of scattered in terms of approach and things like that. And one change, and one of the reasons why I want to devote more time to GameMakers content and to actually try to grow it more is that I increasingly feel this is something that I now call the RRR principle, is that basically you want reach. First, you get the reach, then you get the revenue, and that equals relevance. It's supposed to, there's a little bit of tie back to Scarface if you guys notice that reference. But anyway, so I actually think that reach is really important. That's one thing where I actually am probably going to be thinking about how do I broaden the audience, because the more reach I have, the better the recruiting gets. And I think the more people I reach, the better I'm able to learn from more people. More people get access to the content that I deliver. And then, oftentimes, as you guys likely know, when you publish a piece on something, a lot of feedback that you get through DMs and feedback can really help sharpen your thinking. So that's one change for me, is that I think I've underinvested, even though like having this content platform has been so impactful to the business in terms of recruiting and being able to raise our rounds of financing and things like that. So that's one change for me, is I do plan on investing a lot more and going for reach and more quantity as well as hopefully quality.
And where do you think you are going to get these people from? So this is going back to the main premise of like the fact that there are not that many gaming professionals as compared to the consumer side. Where do you plan to sort of find and reach to the people that you haven't reached to yet?
Yeah, and I mean, I've talked about this before on the Deconstructor of Fun podcast. Like one of the reasons why I kind of retired was like I felt that if I'm going to go back and do more content, that I either want to go deeper or go more broad. And I mentioned this before, but my brother-in-law has a golf YouTube channel. I remember we both started around the same time in terms of YouTube. And I remember telling him, how many old people that play golf are going to be on YouTube? Are you sure? There's like a shit ton of game people, but I don't know how many golf people there are. And, today he has 370,000 subscribers. He's got so many videos that have reached over 1 million views. And I think to like where we are, it is a niche audience, right? The game development ecosystem is much smaller, but I also think that there's things that we are not quite doing right, because there are like game news YouTube channels and other folks that have gotten substantially greater reach than we have. But I also think it is platform dependent as well. So like when I first started the podcast on Deconstructor of Fun, it was the right time. And so we were able to mass audience very, very easily and organically. And it just blew up. And by the way, like the thing that really blew up the Deconstructor of Fun podcast was when we not only did the weekly Twig news segment, but then I added in a weekly interview. And so then that consistency and having more regular content really drove the numbers higher. And then after that, then we got even more famous people on. And then like, you get Tim Sweeney or something like that, and that drives things higher as well. So I think that that's kind of the direction where I hope to get to, but I know. So the other thing too is like I've got a full-time job that is a priority. So sometimes I might disappear for a bit just because like things are always on fire.
Sure. And so you have been saying that there are things that we are doing wrong, and actually, like one of my questions was kind of like, what? Tell us about how Deconstructor monetized, which I suspect I know how, and tell us about how GameMakers does that, and whether or not anything that was happening at Deconstructor informed what you're doing now at GameMakers. And you mentioned that I want to go more deep or I want to go more broad, and so right now you're going more deep. And because of the scale of Deconstructor, they're able to monetize through an ads-based business, which is distinctly different than none of us have mentioned ads once, which is, I think, actually just really fascinating. But could you talk a little bit more about the things that you think we're all doing wrong? Because I think like that's just like where we can really, really learn.
Can I drop one thing here?
Yeah,
so
sure.
I think like cross promotion, we could do a lot better, like between all of us. I usually read everybody's newsletters, but I don't really see a lot of links to each other's like newsletters. That's like something we could do. I think the audience overlap is amazing. So and it's not like if somebody's reading, Deconstructor of Fun, they're not going to read Naavik or the other way around. I think it's like those kind of if you're thinking about growing, that's the most obvious thing we should be doing.
Interesting. Yeah, collusion. I like it. We can do what mobile games do, which is just everybody will market their own games and their own portfolio to the same users. So that's perfect. JK, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt.
Yeah, so I think in terms of things that we're doing wrong, I think it depends on the medium. So I think one thing Joakim is doing right is essentially the things that he has in terms of templates and things like that. And I know, Aaron, you mentioned that you tried lead magnets, but it didn't work out so well. I do think there's a path there where whether it's through free tools that you have to sign up for to subscribe to the newsletter, and Twitter, which, again, I suck at and I'm not going to do for a long time, but I do think those can help drive newsletter. I like a few weeks ago, I checked out all of our YouTube numbers. Well, maybe not you, Joakim, but like whether it's you guys or me or Deconstructor, the YouTube numbers are like bad, right? So I think like the biggest platform is obviously podcast, right? So like on podcast, you can drive a big audience, especially if you have regular content. And I would say, I think by regular, you should be posting at least 2 episodes a week. I don't do that, but if you really want to drive podcast, I think that's what it takes. And then on YouTube, I think that either the content, the format, or something is just not working. I mean, in some cases, like I think my best video was a Tim Sweeney interview, and that's got like 45K views. But like, there's unless you got someone super famous, I don't think. And some of my YouTube stuff does a few thousand, but the ones that don't will just do a few hundred, and there's something that could be done better on YouTube as an example. So I would say newsletter. I think you got to figure out viral loops and lead magnets or free tools that you have to subscribe to get access to. YouTube, I think it's a format thing as well as just trying to figure out that platform better. And podcasts, I think you need to have regular content at least twice a week. And you need somebody interesting, like somebody like, one of the great things about Deconstructor of Fun podcast is we were able to get Eric. And Eric Kress is just extremely entertaining, smart, and he's a natural guy. And I think that also helped a lot when we were growing as well.
Yeah. I actually just, Crest came down for the Sanford conference panel thing that I had the other day. So we caught up, which is always very fun. And he's sitting in the back of the classroom, just like taking shots at people, which is just always the best.
The thing that I don't think so, and by the way, to your point, Alex, there are a lot of new people kind of jumping on, trying to do podcasts and things like that. But I got to say, a lot of them don't understand the entertainment side. Like if you're going to do a podcast, people don't just want to sit there and, hear you drone on about this, whatever, right?
But
You need a little bit of entertainment. You need a little bit of fire and pizzazz. And that's the one thing that I think Eric Kress really brought to the DOF podcast is dude's entertaining and he's got insight. That's the magic formula. You need both.
Isn't the entertainment even more like highlighted on YouTube, like that kind of angle?
Yeah.
What do you think?
Definitely.
The other thing I would say too is like, at least for us, JK, like, or at least I'll speak for myself. Like, we're not making YouTube specific videos, right? We're like having conversations that we're putting all over the place. If we were to make content specifically for YouTube, it would probably look really different.
Right.
And maybe we should, or maybe that's down the road or something like that. But I think it's just a completely different type of content and skill set that goes into making like each of these, verticals really, really pop in their own way. And for Naavik, I mean, the thing that we're going to lean more into is just like we've seen now what type of content works the very best for us and drives the most traffic and signups and things like that. Like I mentioned, like the Axie Infinity deconstruction. We had another one before on like Genshin Impact, or like Piers Kicks, who's at Delphi and has done a lot of work with Bitcraft too. He wrote a piece called like Into the Void, where crypto meets the metaverse. That these are like really in-depth, long-form content that are saying something fresh, are hitting the zeitgeist, and like just drive a lot of interest in some way. But they're also really hard to do, and the reason we haven't done much of that is because like, one, it's hard to do. Not many people can pull it off. And also, it's just like finding the right business model to support that kind of thing consistently is hard. Like, you can't rely just on volunteers to make something like that happen. Most people themselves can't do that repeatedly. And even, for us with Naavik in a consulting business, where we've kind of been reinvesting into content in different ways, it's hard to just, reinvest into that. And then there are trade-offs with what do you drop for other things. And so, we're thinking about like, how do we scale that up and kind of infuse some of these new business models? Like, we invest a lot of our own capital from Naavik to, make all of the content we do possible across all the contributors, editors, things like that. But, how can we start infusing, like Alex, you said we hadn't mentioned ads, which is interesting. We're going to start thinking about like who are really like the best partners for us that are aligned with what we're doing, who can even contribute in some way, partner with us on stuff to create more of this content that we know pops, that I suspect will then kind of drive more audience building and growth and things like that. Well, of course, we'll see as we go. But the hard thing about going broad is that, like, for each specific thing you focus on, whether it's a newsletter or a deep dive or a podcast or YouTube, each of those specific things takes very different, as I mentioned, like skill sets and like types of effort to really make each one pop. And so when you go broad, you can cover a lot of space, but it's harder to like really make any one specific thing pop. And so, we're gonna go back to our roots, where we know that we can make things excel, and try to use that to kind of drive the feedback loop, the engine of everything else, so to speak. So we'll try. We'll see what happens. We'll all learn along the way.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, just a real quick point on Joakim's point about, collaboration. I do think that that's also pretty powerful. Like, it was like a week or two back, I saw a big spike in my subscribers, and I was like, oh, that's weird. I wonder what that was from. And then I got some DMs mentioning to me that I was in Benedict Evans, like he had linked one of my articles. And I went and I tried to find it. I was like, where is this? And it was like a tiny little link in his newsletter, but he's got so many subscribers that, like, that makes a huge difference. So I do think whether it's collab or having somebody else that has a big platform like a Benedict Evans, if they link to you, it does have a big impact.
Sure. And then in terms of, so we talked about the cross collaboration, but what about actually like the communities themselves? So like, I think one of the most interesting things about DOF is the Slack channel, obviously, which we hear about like ad nauseum. But I'm in the Slack channel and I love it. And I talk in there and I learn a lot of things from that. And so I'm wondering how we think about the role of the community part and the almost like the free crowdsourcing information versus the premium content and paid gating everything behind it. Joakim, I don't know if you have started a Slack channel of all the founders that subscribe to Elite Game Developers, but one might suppose that if they all start talking to each other, they may no longer need you anymore. I'm not. That's not obviously exactly accurate, but I think that's what I think of. I've thought a lot about that as well. Is sort of like, what's the role of the community Slack channel and what's the role of the premium content? Does that make any sense?
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm sounding confusing, but
I think I've been thinking about that for years. Like, when do I have a Slack or a Discord for founders? I think one of the key reasons I've been holding back on it is like that would actually require me to get somebody else on board. I think like doing it well, like running live ops for a community is like it's a big job. It's not like you can just use ChatGPT to come up with new cool things for people to do every day. So like I think that's one of the reasons. I don't really want to create like a ghost town Slack or a Discord if I don't do it really carefully. So that's the main reason I haven't done it yet.
That's wise, because Naavik created a ghost town, and in some ways with our Discord. With Naavik, I mean, we sort of have two tiers of community. We have our contributors, and basically like 95% of our contributors have come from our audience, because they like what we do. They want to be a part of it. Like, we have our own Slack where there's lots of conversation and things across, lots of different channels. And then of course there are like the benefits of like, getting feedback on what you do, the connections Naavik has and how it's led to, different people's jobs and investments and rounds and things like that add value. But yeah, creating a community for everyone, I've learned, is a lot harder than it looks. And you like really have to put time and effort aside to make sure that it blossoms and that it holds over time. They're definitely hard to maintain. And so, the mistake we made was just doing too many things at once. And that was like one of the things that just sort of dropped. And we, of course, hope to get back to it at some point because we think it's important. But kind of in the order of operations of all the things that we're doing, community hasn't quite made that list of like being the next big thing that we like really want to put all of our efforts around, just because we've learned that it's harder than it looks. But I would love to not have a ghost town, but also to just like a bigger picture. We have we're talking about like there is more room for cross collaboration. The way I view it is just that like I think there's room for more people to share their voices and share their learnings and all of that kind of stuff more broadly, but I don't want that to turn into more silos. And I think that with the rise of Substack and things like that, it sort of has gone on that trajectory, which is great and empowering to individuals. But I do think that there's more that people can do to like team up in ways beyond just like sharing links. Like, what would it look like if we were all to like build a community together, for example? Or like, what would it look like if we were to, not just do all of our own content individually, but like work on more stuff together, or fold certain platforms into one. And like the more you think about it, the more complicated it gets. Reality is complicated, but I think like expanding that conversation to be more about lowering silos, I think is probably where the most powerful next steps in all of this might lie.
Yeah, and I don't mean to jump in here, but one of my recommendations in that paper that I ended up writing, because I had to make a recommendation as part of like the requirements for this essay, is that we should consolidate the podcasting and blogging groups. So basically combine premium brands that have strong writing teams with those that have the best podcasts and those that have the best consulting services. And this could create some sort of consolidated audience expansion that might actually enable to scale business, right? So I think that is actually something that I was going to ask you guys about. And like a final question is sort of, what do you guys think about that, right? If JK, you're a free to play mogul on mobile, and Joakim, you basically serve founders, and Aaron, we're doing financial markets and stuff like that, updates, right? Like one could consider that's all basically a buffet menu of support, right? And and then you have the new stuff with Deconstructor, right? Like what would the world look like if all like of these big brands were to combine together? And if that's true, sort of like, do you think that that's something that's realistic to hit a enterprise and business scale, in which case it could be profitable or not? Or does that just put on too much bloat and then the cost structure is too heavy and the users are still the same?
It's an interesting thought. I do think from a content and consistency perspective, like you could release content every day in that scenario, but I don't know. Yeah, interesting to think about.
So I've thought about this a lot, actually, and it's easier said than done, is the way that I'll put it, because the main reason why is, sort of what we've talked about here, is that like the actual businesses that we have are so different, and the content serves those businesses in different ways. And so it's not even just about combining content, it's about thinking about like the implications of like, if you combine content, what does that mean for the businesses behind them? And I think that there still is some merit in thinking about that. Like, sure, what if you had consulting and investing and game making in some ways, like under the same roof? I think you could unlock some interesting, like really interesting things, and that'd be pretty powerful. But when you do that, you're dealing with like individuals or organizations in different stages, with different cap tables, with different goals, that want different things. And it just, like, the more you dig into it, the harder it gets. But I'm all for it in theory. And so I think this is something that we should all talk about, more, offline, or if you're listening, come reach out. It'd be fun conversations to have, whether it's, little collaborations or something bigger. But yeah, interesting thought.
I think at the minimum, whether it's in YouTube land or in music, there's always collaborations between different groups. And I think that the net effect is that it improves both parties. But one thing I also think, instead of going broad, is also going the opposite way. So you had mentioned Slack community. So I do have a private GameMakers Slack channel, which is capped at 55 members. And it's very active. It's very, very active. And on top of that, the other thing that I would recommend for a lot of people to do, and one of the most valuable uses of my time, is actually having like a monthly, tribe, basically a group of 6-7 gaming CEOs that meet and talk about various topics every month. And that has been one of the most useful, uses of my time. And it's just been very, very helpful. And so whether it's the Slack channel where you can, because it's private, there's an advantage in the sense that you could be more open. You can talk about things that you wouldn't want in a channel with a bunch of people and a bunch of lurkers, and who knows who's going to like screen cap and share and do things like that. And, in a private setting with a tribe that you're talking about, you can talk about very sensitive topics that that is going to just be within your group. So I would highly recommend other people, whether you're an executive or, even if you're a product manager, like getting a group of 5 or 6 other product managers to have a monthly call so that you can all get better is some, it's not content related, but I think speaking in terms of more niche and having private groups, I think there's a big advantage.
Yeah, that is a very, very awesome idea, actually. Because I think when you think about going to a big company, right, you might work on a PM team, but if you're at a startup, right, you might be a discipline of a one-of, right? You might be the only producer, you might be the only artist, or you might be the only PM. And I think like that cross-sharing and collaboration, if like your brand gives that avenue and access to do so in that tribe format, is actually really quite powerful. And it's also kind of like what the venture portfolio co pitch is too. So you're kind of like eating into like maybe that value proposition of like what a Makers or Bitcraft or Forerunner or whatever might provide if you're coalescing with that portco, because I think that's also the pitch of like of joining that community as well.
Yeah, I think that's part of the reason why things turn into ghost towns. You put like too many people into one place and they don't discourse anymore. But it needs to be like these small groups, like 5 to 6, like JK said.
Fascinating. Yeah. And then Joakim, I know that you had something to say earlier, but I accidentally, we may have cut you off by going to JK first, but just wanted to give you the airtime in case there was something there.
Yeah, I think like I earlier said, like about this idea of just being consistent, like with a lot of stuff that all of us are doing. Like if you have a bad episode or a newsletter that just didn't work, there's another one next week. There's always the next one. So I think that's something I've learned to deal with, like that if something like I post on social media and there's one person who had reacted to it for 24 hours.
I've got a good example of that
later. Yeah, go ahead.
So I think Elon Musk sent an email about being hardcore or something like that. So as a joke in my newsletter, I took his email and I just changed it around, and I lost like 25 subscribers because they were all pissed off, but they didn't realize it was a joke. Okay. But yeah. So that would be an example of like a bad newsletter where I piss people off.
Sure.
And then I was like, oh, a lot of people don't like Elon. I get it.
Yeah, it's polarizing, right? I think that's actually the question is like, do you go for the polarizing ends if we're talking about going deep or going far, is in terms of that. But fortunately, we're not really like political, I guess.
Chris hasn't been canceled yet, so I guess F is still going.
Yeah. All right, guys. I think that this is actually a perfect note to end on. So our note is that there's always another newsletter. So if one's bad, there's always another one coming. And don't put Elon memes or quotes in your newsletters because it's ostracizing and you'll lose subscribers. So that's the trick. No Elon and more newsletters and consistency.
That's all you need to know.
And so I think for you guys, I think everybody here is so easily accessible via their own blogging services. But once more, Aaron from Naavik and JK from GameMakers and Joakim from Elite Game Developers, everybody in the audience, if you want to access any of these guys, just go and follow their channels. Look them up on Google. Should be very easy actually, since we're front-facing community brands. And so on that note, we'll be concluding. Big thank you, JK, Aaron, and Joakim for coming on. Thank you to our listeners, and I'll be back in 2 weeks. And so until next time, friends, feel free to hit me up at alexandra@naavik.co if you have any questions, comments, or concerns. Would love to hear your feedback. And with that, au revoir. Bye, guys.
If you enjoyed today's episode, whether on YouTube or your favorite podcast app, make sure to like, subscribe, comment, or give a 5-star review. And if you want to reach out or provide feedback, shoot us a note at podcast@naavik.co or find us on Twitter and LinkedIn. Plus, if you want to learn more about what Naavik has to offer, make sure to check out our website, www.naavik.co. There, you can sign up for the #1 games industry newsletter, Naavik Digest, or contact us to learn about our wide-ranging consulting and advisory services. Again, that is www.naavik.co. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you in the next episode.